This is another episode of Rip Rap, the academic book television program, which is part of the Academic Book Network. Our guest today is Robert Hass, who is, among other things, the former Poet Laureate of the United States. We're also going to be talking about his newest book, Sun Under Wood, and then one of his previous books, 20th Century Pleasures. And as I understand it, you now have one that's just on the way to the bookshops called
Poet's Choice.
Poet's
yeah.
Choice.
Mm-hmm.
Robert, this is the whole idea of the Poet Laureate, and I think last night when you were presenting your lecture, you said it was called, what, a consultant?
The original title was Consultant in Poetry to the Library of Congress, yeah.
But the idea of the Poet Laureate, you've actually developed this a little bit. Can you explain some of that and how you've made it a little more active than what it was before?
Yeah. The position was created by Archibald MacLeish and Franklin Roosevelt, poet Archibald MacLeish, who's, I think, best known for a play about Job that was produced on Broadway in the 50s. MacLeish was one of the New Deal intellectuals, an old friend of Roosevelt's, and Roosevelt invited him to Washington because the subject of the future of the Library of Congress came up. This was 1938, 1939. And Washington was, at that time, I think, a pretty sleepy little Jim Crow southern town with a small bureaucracy and semi-permanent nomadic group of politicians, congressmen and senators wheeling in and out of town. And it was to give some kind of cultural life to the capital that MacLeish and Roosevelt dreamed up the idea of having a poet in residence at the Library of Congress who would invite American writers to come to Washington to read at the library, and who would create for the library an archive of recordings of American novelists and poets reading. So the position was created in 1939 or 40, and many wonderful American writers, Robert Frost and William Carlos Williams, was appointed, but got a stroke not long afterwards. I think never came to Washington to serve. But Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lowell and others were consultants in poetry, the Library of Congress. In 1984, at the initiative of a congressman, the title was changed to Poet Laureate of the United States, and the first Poet Laureate of the United States was Robert Penn Warren. And the job description didn't change, it just had a grander title. But as a result of this name with English, this grand name with English echoes, the role of being Poet Laureate evolved, which is a one-year appointment. The official appointment is made by the Librarian of Congress, who I think is advised by a committee for that purpose. I never did find out exactly how the process occurred. It's an annual position, but renewable. No one has ever done it for more than 2 years. Don't think anyone has ever wanted to do it. So the job, which was still essentially set up a reading series for the city of Washington, evolved. More things became possible. Typically what happens is that a new Poet Laureate is appointed, and there's a round of interviews, and that's it. But my predecessor, one of my predecessors, Joseph Brodsky, a great poet, Nobel Prize-winning Russian emigre poet who lived and taught in the United States for the last 15 years of his life, when he was interviewed by the New York Times, said, "I think Americans should read poetry. I think there should be a book of poetry in every hotel room next to the Gideon Bible. And poetry ought to be on racks in supermarkets." And a young man in Washington heard this and got excited about it, energized about it, and created a little foundation to get poetry out into the world. So that was the sort of the first public initiative on the part of a poet laureate, though Joseph Brodsky supported this. It was essentially just his proposing it that encouraged this young man to get going. The next poet laureate was Rita Dove, who was my immediate predecessor, who is was rather young to be appointed to the position a poet, a novelist, a playwright, and a black woman. And her appointment, I think, made her such a role model for particularly African-American kids around the country and for women around the country, that she got many invitations to visit schools, speak in public, appear on Sesame Street. And she did a lot of stuff to encourage reading and writing among kids. So when I came into the position, there was some expectation, or at least possibility, of a more public role for the poet laureate as a spokesperson for American letters. And I tried to undertake the job in that spirit.
You had that whole idea of the water in the river shed.
Well, I really didn't know if I wanted to do it because for a bunch of reasons, but one of them was it doesn't pay especially well. The job pays $30,000 a year, and it comes from an endowment. It's great that it comes from an endowment because, though I didn't understand that until later when I would do these interview shows on C-SPAN, and someone would invariably call in and say, "You are a good example of the tomfool stuff the government is spending its money on." And I could say, "Doesn't cost you a cent." This was, in fact, back in the 30s, Roosevelt and McLeish found a friend who endowed the position and all the costs of Poet Laureate's office, this beautiful office in the Jefferson Building at the library. I didn't necessarily want to take the job because I couldn't live on $30,000 a year, especially not in Washington. And so Poet Laureates keep their day jobs, and I was commuting from Berkeley to Washington.
Oh my God.
I got very efficient at working on airplanes. And then once I started doing the quasi-ambassadorial work of being the Poet Laureate, I was traveling other places all the time. So I was out on the road a lot. Anyway, I thought about it. I decided to do it. And I had 2 or 3 ideas. One was I thought there was, and there is, a crisis of literacy in the country, and particularly in American schools. We're not teaching a significant number of our kids how to read. It's on the agenda now, but 3 years ago when I came into the post, people weren't talking about it. They particularly weren't talking about it in California. Or if they were blaming it on everything but the causes. So I thought this gave me a chance to go around and say, in California, where the problem really does have to do with a starved tax base, to say what no politician would say. We have to pay to educate our kids. So that was project number 1, was if I was going to be a spokesperson for American letters, then you start um, as Yeats says in one of his poems, where all the ladders start in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. I thought you should begin at the beginning and say, we teach our kids how to read. That's number one. So that was one project. The other one was, there's enormous liveliness and interest and great range in American poetry right now. Tremendous amount of poetry being written. As you know, in every university, town, or big city in the country, there are poetry readings, poetry cafes, poetry slams. There are lots of presses, lots of magazines, such as the one that you edited for so many years. There's a lot of activity, and poetry, which used to belong to public culture, didn't belong to public culture. So the other thing I want to do is try to figure out how to get poetry back into public life. And I thought one of the ways to do that would be through newspapers, and of course another way would be television and radio. So that was project number 2. And project number 3 was, because I was the first poet laureate from the Western United States, I thought that some of the stuff that I did ought to reflect the environmental tradition in American literature and in Western writing. So one of the things I did was raise some money to have an event at the Library of Congress in the spring of 1996, at a time when there's a great appetite in Congress to undo the work of environmental protection. I invited 50 American writers in the environmental writing tradition to come to Washington for a week and talk and read their work. And we also we didn't have money to pay them, but we invited them to come, 1,000 community activists involved with water quality issues around the country. And they all came, and it was a wonderful event. At the time, it seemed that while I was talking about these two kinds of literacy, getting people to develop basic reading skills and try to address the fact that a lot of people who can read don't, I thought that the third kind of literacy that needed to be addressed was environmental literacy, that we also need to see to it, and a lot of good work is being done in this area. Need to see to it that our kids have a fundamental understanding of the biological and ecological and human process in the places where they live. And that was another element of mirroring back the American people, the powerful things in our imaginative tradition.
It seemed to also reflect your idea that the poet isn't someone sequestered away from society and culture, but is connected.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be. I mean, some of our great poets, I guess the most notable instance is Emily Dickinson, were sequestered, writing poetry or doing any kind of work of that kind. It takes a lot of solitude, a lot of privacy. Emily Dickinson was an extremely private person all her life, and her entire public life occurred after her death when her poems were published. And I think that's great model for poets. I grew up with the idea of the poet as a public intellectual, of the writer as a public intellectual. Not all of them were, but I grew up loving the essays of writers about writing. I think when I was in college, James Baldwin's essays were appearing that changed my perceptions of race in America. Norman Mailer was then writing the presidential papers, and those essays, both the essays of Mailer and of Baldwin, sent me to the essays of Albert Camus, and to that French tradition of writers addressing public issues. And then in the 60s, I grew up in San Francisco. Poets like Allen Ginsberg and Gary Snyder and Lawrence Ferlinghetti had things to say about the House Un-American Activities Committee and civil rights and censorship and the future of the country. And so it was part of what I understood as a possible way for a possible part of the responsibilities that might go with being a poet. And mostly I haven't done that. Mostly I've, in my life, done my work and done my writing. And when this job came up, I thought this was the time. May also have to do with middle age, that I became a kind of sadhu. You know, my children were grown and I had a little bit of more time I could give to the world, and so it seemed like a time to do it.
I thought your book, The 20th Century Pleasures, is an example of a writer talking, with other writers, which is different than a critic talking about writers, and it's really delightful.
Thank you.
And you have that extraordinary ability at taking some details and some ideas and then looking at them and sifting them, and not only doing that but bringing in the other philosophical and literary kinds of perceptions and insight into it. And like we were talking earlier about what you were doing with James Wright, and I remember one sentence in there where you said you didn't mind how often he used the word, but you minded how and when he used it.
Yeah. I got a PhD in English, and I was trained in the way that people were trained then to write critical essays. And I mean, there is a whole range of writing that scholars and academic critics and writers do, and theorists. Some of it is very technical, and some of it is tries to address a larger public. And in the criticism of poetry, I felt like things had come to a pass where people were talking almost entirely to themselves or each other, and that some territory for the literary essay had to be won back for the public, the non-professional public arena. And so I set out to write these essays, really to teach myself, to unteach myself the habits that I had learned in graduate school, and figure out how to write like a person thinking, and not like a professional addressing other professionals. There's times, of course, when that kind of writing is completely appropriate, and in a way, there are qualities of adventurousness in thought that you can only get to if you stay inside the specialized vocabularies that you're working with, in the same way that a mathematician can't be explaining to people who've had first-year calculus every step he's taking if he's going to get any place. A critic might feel the same way about what she's doing with difficult areas of and in crucial theoretical areas, and thinking about literary study or historical study or the way you go about doing anthropology. I'm not against that kind of writing, but I set out to teach myself to do the other kind of thing. In this book, sometimes I look back at the essays and think, boy, I could have gotten there a lot faster if I wasn't so determined to say at most points, well, here's what I don't know. Here's the area where I'm confused. I don't think about this. I used to resent the ways in criticism that the critic would talk about these issues without you getting a glimpse of why they cared about them or what was at stake. Now, there's a good deal of subjectivity in all kinds of academic discourse. In fact, it seems often enough that people feel like they have to write an autobiographical preface or first chapter to let the reader know that a flesh and blood person is thinking about these issues. And sometimes now I just wish they'd cut to the chase.
I thought it was interesting, too, that you would bring some of the technical terms in.
I love the details of the art, and I'm fascinated by them. And, you know, in the same way that kids who like movies would get interested in camera angles and film editing rhythm. And
Talking about the French, there is that touch, you know, that distinction that's made that when it's done well, which you do well with it, gives it that little nuance or that distinction that brings out something. I mean, it's not, you seem to use it very carefully, but when you did it, then you'd say, oh yeah, that's in that meter or something.
well, I'm glad you thought it worked.
And in your own poetry, there was an interesting thing you said when in the comments you were making last night about you did envision your poetry as being naturalistic or something.
Mm-hmm. I was born in San Francisco and spent my first years as an urban kid, but when I was pretty young, moved to what became a suburb but was then country. And I've always had a great passion for the outdoors and for natural history. In the 60s, when I was reading poetry with great excitement and starting to write it, I was attracted to the traditions of American nature poetry. Gary Snyder, the California poet, Wendell Berry, the Kentucky poet and farmer, and others. They were also poets who were, in their different ways, not just writing poems about the natural world, but thinking about American culture, American civilization, I guess would be the way to say it, and how we live in place. And I was very attracted to that tradition of writing. But at a certain point, and so there's a lot of that in my first book of poems, Field Guide, which was published by Yale University Press 25 years ago. After I wrote the book, which had a lot of poems in it that were in some way about place, you know, I wanted to, and I had good reasons for doing it that I had articulated to myself, but I realized I didn't want to do it for the rest of my life. In the literature of China and Japan and even of England that I love, people had lived with place by letting the natural world come up as metaphors for stuff that goes on in the ordinary processes of life. There's a poem of Rilke's that I love that begins, it's called Initiation. It goes, Wer du auch seist, am Abend tritt hinaus. But if anybody listening or watching can actually pronounce German, you can forgive my German pronunciation, but whoever you are, in the evening go outside. Aus deine Stube, welke müde kaum, wer du auch seist. Whoever you are, go outside, out past your doorstep, and into the world, whoever you are. And then he says, and on the horizon, with your eyes, slowly lift a tree. Slender by itself, the German phrase is schlank, allein. And then there's this explosive thing. So whoever you are in the autumn evening, go outside, go out past your doorstep, and on the horizon, with your eyes, slowly raise one tree, one skinny tree, all by itself. And the next phrase in German is, und hatte die Welt gemacht. English translation, and you have made the world.